Today's interview is a little bit different. I invited my friend and colleague, Dr. Mike Cove, on the podcast. He is the curator of mammalogy at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And we were chatting, and he mentioned that he wanted to talk to me about forest elephants. And I did my dissertation research on forest elephants. So rather than just him and me talk privately, we thought it would be fun to have this scientific chat on the podcast. To set some context, he's been thinking about disturbances, about more disturbed habitats that some small carnivores and rodents are attracted to, even tied to, and was just thinking about how those habitats were created thousands of years ago and how our landscape looked different. We had many different animals. We had the Pleistocene megafauna like Mastodons, these large giant ground sloths, and we talk about how that shaped the earth and these mammal communities. He wanted to know how forest elephants affect the forest today and what influence that they have on the environment. And we toy with the concept of Pleistocene rewilding, which scientists have proposed bringing back species that resemble these extinct Pleistocene species to redo these to restore these ecological processes. So bringing elephants over to the United States. So we'll talk about this concept in depth in the podcast. I hope you enjoy this crazy fun conversation. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. It's good to interact with a friend when we don't get all that much interaction these days.
Yeah, so we used to talk science a lot when we worked with each other, but we haven't had a chance to. And Mike wanted to ask me some questions about forest elephants in terms of what he's been thinking about with some research that he's doing. But first, why don't you tell everyone, give them a background of yourself, so what you're doing right now and how you got there.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I'm the curator of mammalogy at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And I have been in this role, I started March 16th. So I have been in this role. I'm a full-on COVID mammologist. I have only worked at the museum in the age of our global pandemic. But the majority of what I do is I oversee the mammal collection that we have at the museum. And so one of the cool things that I don't think a lot of folks realize is that museums, in addition to having these educational outreach exhibits and a format for learning so much about the natural world, are actually the repositories of most of the biodiversity data that we've historically collected. And so the Mammology Collection has over 20,000 specimens, vouchered specimens, which means that could be anything from tiny bat skulls all the way up to a full polar bear mount or whale skeletons. And so we have over 20,000 of those, and they're hidden. They're actually 2 floors underground in kind of an underground warehouse. And you can just get lost in those collection shelves where you're just going up and down the aisles and opening the drawers and pulling out all of these different specimens. And all of them tell an interesting and unique story. And so we can use those data. All of the, I should have brought one. All of the animals have a little tag that say, the species, wood rat, for example, and we could see where it was collected and when. And so then we could go contemporarily and say, okay, we saw wood rats right here in Raleigh as recently as the 80s. But we haven't seen any since then. And so what might have caused them to be lost from this area? And so that's a lot of what we're able to do with these historical collections, is think about mapping biodiversity historically, and then revisit contemporary biodiversity and think about how best we could use those historical data to inform current and future conservation efforts to restore habitats. And so that is why we're talking today, because I've been thinking a lot about even prehistory and how animals have interacted, tens of thousands of years ago, and where we're at now in terms of habitat and conservation, and moving forward with restoring habitat for some of these endangered and threatened species here in North Carolina, but also more broadly across the country and the world. So that's where my research stands now. And I do a lot of work with rodents. There's not a lot of folks that are interested in rodents, but rodents are, the most rich group of mammals. They have the most species of mammals.
Yeah, they're the most species rich, not financially rich.
Yeah, not financially rich. No, we're probably the poorest. A lot of the conservation funding goes towards, kind of the charismatic megafauna, the tigers, the leopards, the polar bears, and the elephants, and a little less for things like wood rats, which I'm sure most folks haven't even heard of. And Stephanie, someday we can do a whole podcast on wood rats.
Yeah, we really should. Yes. No, we really should, because what you have, there's lots of trajectories with wood rats that we could talk about. We'll definitely do that. We'll set a date. Mm-hmm. And Mike also has a lot of experience camera trapping as well. That's how we know each other. He was brought on the eMammal project, and also cats too. He hates this when I mention this, but he does a lot of camera trap work for domestic cats that are either feral or owned, and look at how they impact the community as well.
Right. Yep. So that is another component of my research, is I study the impacts of invasive species usually, and some, one of them is a cuddly killer, the house cat, right? Domestic cats. And so just thinking about, we don't know how many cats there are out in the environment. And so just trying to use non-invasive techniques like the camera traps, where we're not catching or harming the cats, but we're identifying them based on their patterns and estimating how many there are in order to figure out a solution moving forward, right? Because if you don't even know how many cats there are out in the environment, then it's really difficult to assess their impacts on bird communities or rodent communities, lizards, snakes and things, but also how best to manage them, or how to evaluate how managing them, either via neutering or adopting them out, or
euthanasia programs,
to these sending them to these cat sanctuaries. And so there's all there's that we'll have another podcast.
I'll have you for wood rats, and then a separate, honestly, cats would be a really great podcast episode. Okay. But today,
it is a controversial topic.
Yeah,
it is a controversial topic for sure.
But today we're talking about forests. So when you started talking, you were talking about these small rodents and mesocarnivores. What were you explaining to me?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I study a lot of small animals, and not just rodents. I've looked at, little known fact, my master's research originally was focused on the eastern spotted skunk, which is in the Ozarks of Missouri. And I lived out of my car. I lived out of my 1998 Buick Regal, driving all over the Ozarks for like 8 months, trapping for spotted skunks. And I never caught a single spotted skunk. Never. I caught plenty of striped skunks. I caught plenty of raccoons and opossums. And I ended up kind of, what's a final report like that look like? It says, yes, the spotted skunk warrants its endangered status here in Missouri, because I could not find any And I had the data to show that I was at least successful at catching a lot of other things, but not spotted skunks, right? And so there's been a lot of research, all surrounding this kind of enigmatic small skunk, and they're a little bit smaller than the striped skunks. They're actually closer to the size of a squirrel. And there's been a lot of research to show that they associate with thick thickets and hemlocks and what is it called? Rhododendrons and mountain laurels, all of these different plants that grow along, mountain creeks and riparian corridors, like along creeks and streams, but also in these kind of, newly growing areas where there's lots of thick understory. So young forests with lots of cover. And it seems like what happens there is, if you have a lot of understory, the skunks and other small carnivores, maybe weasels, and plenty of the rodents, right? The wood rats that I feel so strongly about, golden mice, lots of others, jumping mice. There's a whole bunch of different rodents that have also declined historically, because they depend on these, what we would call, they're not exclusively tied to these habitats, but they associate with them because there's lots of cover for them to hide from predators. And so if you're a small, mammal this big running around in the forest, if there's not a lot of vegetation for you to duck under, then you're easy prey for things like great horned owls or hawks, or coyotes that are kind of novel to the East Coast, to the Eastern US, and over the past couple decades, other predators like bobcats, things like that, even raccoons. And so, I think that, and I'm guilty of this, I have always thought of these early successional habitats as not having as much value as a forest, as a giant, primary forest, old growth forest with, trees this big around. I've always assumed that that's the pinnacle of what the plant community should look like, right? And we should strive to protect all the forests, and it should all look like that. And coming to North Carolina, I realized that, there's so much more than just forest. There's pine savannas, longleaf pine savannas, right, that were historically maintained through lightning strikes and fires roaring through the understory. And so a lot of management now kind of tries to simulate these natural processes that were suppressed, like fire, prescribed fires and things like that. And it got me thinking, in North Carolina, historically, prehistorically, right? I'm using the term historically too loosely here. We had megafauna and mega herbivores, just like there are in Africa and Asia today, right? So we didn't necessarily have elephants, but we had pretty close allies. We had the mastodons, which are somewhere between a forest elephant and a savanna elephant, pretty large, a large elephant-like
morphologically speaking.
And morphologically speaking, yeah. And we would have had mammoths, right? In some areas, maybe not necessarily in North Carolina. I would have to look at maps, but we had these mega herbivores that were going around. And when I think about those now, I just picture them, walking through forests like they're bulldozers, right? And so they would just knock over trees, and what happens when you knock over a couple trees, or you eat out all the vegetation or pull all the branches off of a tree, all the
Mm-hmm.
light gets through to the ground, and it allows a lot of other things to flourish. And I suspect that a lot of those things that would come up from the ground might be important food for rodents
Mm-hmm.
and other, small, not just mammal. I'm highly biased towards mammals, so many of my examples are mammal centric. But these early
That's
successional
okay.
habitats are critically important for endangered butterflies and all different types of other you know herpetofauna, reptiles and amphibians too, and some birds that associate with those newly regenerating habitats. So, but I think that so much of the soft fruits and things that rodents eat come from these vines and small shrubs and things that pop up very fast as soon as a
Mm-hmm.
light gap opens up. And so what it really has me thinking is that mastodons matter, and we forget that mastodons were here, you know, concurrently with early humans in North America. They overlapped, and presumably humans played a role in their extinction. And so it just really has me thinking about what their absence on a landscape has played a role in the distribution of so many of these other animals, and what habitats even look like now versus what they might have looked like prehistorically. Because while some of these animals are rare or threatened contemporarily, they can persist in old
Mm-hmm.
growth forests and things like that, but maybe they're not thriving as well as they should be, or maybe they're really limited to areas like stream beds, where there's still a lot of light that gets through, and some thick vegetation around stream beds, as opposed to or rocky outcrops, for example, and there's cover there for them to avoid predators. But maybe those environments would have been much more common, or would still be quite common, if the elk were still around, or, still fairly common. They're introduced in the Smokies. And so even just studying what role elk play in changing plant communities in the Smokies would be pretty fascinating. But what would an elephant-like animal be doing to these environments? And so I don't know. That's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because you have so much expertise in elephants and forest elephants specifically, but a lot. Can you hear my daughter in the background?
Yeah, that's okay.
Oh,
We're very low
she's
key on
having
this
fun.
podcast.
She's enthusiastic when she can hear my enthusiasm. She's feeding off of it. I'm excited. Daddy's talking about mastodons. So yeah, I really want to know. I really want to have a conversation, because I don't know what the answer is.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to start renting elephants from the North Carolina Zoo, and releasing them in little pens in the Smokies to see how much they change the forest? Something tells
I
me we're probably not going to be doing that anytime
Yeah,
soon.
I actually remember so this is actually a real concept that scientists had, I don't know, I guess over a decade ago now. Because I remember I was in Kenya when somebody was talking about this idea, and it's called rewilding, and it's exactly that, like bringing back these large herbivores to North American landscapes where a lot of them are now extinct, or they're greatly declined, to try to regenerate the different types of ecosystems that we've had back then. So yeah, the answer to your question, elephants would have a huge impact. So savanna elephants 100% because so all elephants are ecosystem engineers or keystone species, but savanna elephants, when you actually have them in too high densities, they can for sure turn a forested habitat, like a more arid, dry scrub forest, into a savanna habitat. And sometimes so much so that it is, completely arid and really susceptible to drought, which has led to culling programs, which is a nicer way of saying killing elephants. And those are extremely controversial because elephants are really intelligent, and there's a lot of evidence to show that elephants that have been through these programs actually remember them. Like they seem to experience trauma. And it's just kind of icky to think about killing elephants. A lot of people just don't like it, even if they're okay with hunting of other animals.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
But forest elephants, so forest elephants affect the forest a little bit differently. So savanna elephants, they'll like push over trees to eat leaves, and they eat a lot of bark and branches and things like that. And forest elephants will too, but they really love fruit. That's the big thing. So they eat, where I studied them, they ate about over 200 species of fruit. And they disperse the seeds of the fruit. That's what's really important, or the important role of forest elephants.
Right.
Oh, they can be really small. They don't have to be big.
Oh, they can.
Yeah, they eat fruits of all different sizes. So some of them are like, giant, like grapefruit sized things. That's probably the biggest. I don't think. I'm not an expert on their diet, so I actually don't know for sure, but I think that's the biggest. And then they eat, like, we would have these little like bushes that they're called guavas, and they're just like about like the size of a grape, and you can eat them too. They're really delicious actually, and they'll just like pluck them off with their trunk tips and
so they're very delicate compared to the savanna elephants.
Yes.
Interesting.
And they do affect the ground too, and the forest composition, because like you said, they do charge through the forest and break branches and stuff. I do think it's a little bit more delicate than you think it is. I do think they tend to take the path of least resistance. So they're not necessarily like, I'm going to go through the forest and like just charge through. There, you will find elephant paths throughout the forest. And they do like these fruiting trees too. So there's actually been studies to show that they have stronger and more well-traversed paths and larger paths leading up to these major fruiting trees. So those create kind of like permanent light gaps in the forest. Those paths do. And then
do those paths end up being, presumably fairly wide, because the elephants live in large groups, right? How large are their groups?
They're not that large. So the forest elephant groups, they're really only, the most common group is honestly an adult and her calves. So they're usually seen, and this is what my dissertation research was on. But like the biggest group size I think I saw was like, it was like maybe like 17 elephants in one place. And that was huge.
Oh, but that's right.
Yeah, that was huge. Usually the biggest group size would be closer to like 7, and that would include babies. So the forest elephant, they're not in these big groups. And really the only places where they get in these big groups is what are called byes. And these are, they're natural clearings in the forest, but I suspect they were made by animals, especially forest elephants. And they're really rich in minerals. And the elephants will dig up the soils and drink the water and eat the soils and stuff. And doing that maintains the clearing, so there's no vegetation growing in it. And some of these byes can be huge. So the most famous is Zonga Bai. And at Zonga Bai, when there wasn't a poaching issue, there were at least 40 elephants in the bai every day at a time.
Oh, wow.
But
So how big is that? Do you know like roughly
I
how
don't,
large that is?
I don't know
I've
off
seen
the
some
top of my
videos of
head.
these. They're pretty
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah.
But at Langway
Wow.
Bay, which is another big bay that I visited in Gabon, there were the day I visited probably a total of 10 elephants there.
Hmm.
So not necessarily lots of animals all at the same time. So
Gotcha.
I don't think forest elephants are turning over like the soil as much and destroying trees as much. And I think I read somewhere that they don't push trees over unless they're less than like a couple of inches in diameter. So they're not uprooting trees to get fruits. Um,
Hmm.
so it's more about like the seed dispersal and the light gaps from their trails. But going up to those buys, the trails are big. The forest elephant trails that we used, honestly, they're not that big. It's kind of like if you're hiking, you know, like a state park here, the trails
Really?
are, yeah, they're not that big. I mean, they're obviously big because they're elephants, but they're
Right.
smaller than you think.
Yeah.
Or I
Huh.
guess like I don't know,
Interesting.
the vegetation like bounces back, so it's like
Right.
they're
So,
very
but that's the question, right? So
yeah
the vegetation is pretty thick along those edges. It's like a
yeah
trodden path. And then along the edges, there's enough light getting through that there's probably some thick, lush vegetation to the sides of it, presumably, right?
yes yeah it's both. There's some though with you know more of a clear forest floor, and
Hmm.
in Lope, where I worked, they actually do prescribed burns because they have savanna habitats from humans, I guess thousands of years ago, and they want to maintain those savannas because some animals, like the forest buffalo, they'll die without those savannas, so they maintain them.
Right. Right. Interesting. So let me think this through. So would the vegetation along these elephant trails be thicker, denser, better quality than if you picked a random plot in the forest, or would you not really be able to tell?
I'm sure you'd be able to tell, but I don't know the answer to that. And I guess it depends
Yeah,
on what, like for what. Um,
right,
you know, like for it would depend on for what species. I do know that elephants are attracted to edges in general. So like creating roads in forests is a huge deal because it increases access to poaching. But I do know that the elephants are actually attracted to the roads because it attracts that successional vegetation that you're talking about. So those new
right,
plants moving in,
right,
they
right,
like
right.
that new growth.
Hmm. And some of those new plants are especially, vines and lianas and things like that that fruit a lot and probably have
Yeah,
tasty fruits on them, presumably.
yeah.
So it makes you wonder if those are attractive to in Africa, if those are attractive to primates, monkeys, and things like that. If you feel like they follow elephants or they're associated with elephants, do you feel like there's anything like that?
I don't think so.
Hmm.
Or at least where I was, I don't think so. I think, yeah, I never heard
They probably have
anyone
enough
talk about that.
resources, like they probably have enough resources up in the trees,
Yeah,
presumably.
really high up that they
But
don't
you
have to
have,
compete with the
yeah.
lower animals.
Right. But you have to imagine that there are some small, the first mammals were this big, right? They were
Yeah.
little shrew-like animals that we all evolved from. Um, and there still are tons of those little shrew-like and rodent animals. And so I have to think that they must use those habitats more than
Yeah.
open understory. And so what's interesting is I did a little research in preparation for our conversation here. Uh, I've been reading a few quaternary journals about some paleontological research looking at microwear in the teeth of mastodons from Florida and a few other spots in the East Coast. And they can even go in there and pull out little cells and diatoms and things like that, and identify they can use the isotopes, which are, carbon and nitrogen from whatever plant that was. And some of these little twigs and things just are preserved as twigs and lodged in. It's
amazing.
And so, And so what I was reading is that they forage, or they browse a lot, right? Browsing, they use their trunk to pull stuff in. So that would defoliate lots of trees and things, but that they were also eating a lot of grasses, which leads me to believe that there would have had to be these open areas where these grasses were prominent, and presumably they played some role in creating those habitats. And so I keep thinking, I've been thinking about this more and more, like some of these animals that modify their environment, we always classify them based on the habitat that they choose. Right. But maybe it's the chicken or the egg. Maybe they're creating their own habitat, and their persistence over time is what is curating that habitat to be the ideal habitat.
It's interesting for you said about savannas. For forest elephants, I don't think they maintain the savannas in low pay because, like I said, they do the prescribed burns. Maybe there's not high enough density of them, but I mean, the savannas, they would get so high. Like sometimes you couldn't even see the elephants. The grasses were so tall.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and I do remember the director talking about that. Yeah. Basically that if they didn't burn them, then, like trees would start moving in, and the forest would take over. But maybe mastodons are different. Asian elephants are different.
Right.
Well, but forest elephants eat more fruits too. Right. They eat the most fruits, and they do eat grass. But usually when I saw them eating grass, it was after a prescribed burn when the grass was really new.
Oh, when it's freshest and most nutrient dense.
Yeah.
So there's probably a big difference there, because the forest elephants are just that. They occur in this, vast tropical, I guess that's is that the Congo?
Yeah, Congo Basin.
Yeah. And so that's, this vast rainforest. And so you have these, the vast majority of the habitat is forest and not much of the successional stuff. And so you would expect the same thing in the Amazon or the Southeast Asian rainforests and stuff. But I suspect that the temperate zones of North America would be a little more heterogeneous, where you have, forests, savannas, the pine ecosystems, and then these, open areas. Especially think about in North Carolina, we have the mountains, the Piedmont, and the coastal plain. And so I think that obviously the soils driven by glaciation affect what plants and plant communities and ecosystems thrive in those three different zones. But at some level, there must have been another top-down effect where these elephantids, is that the right word?
Good question. I never had to say it like that. I always said elephants, I guess.
Yeah.
Elephant species, I would have said.
Elephant allies. I'll call them elephant allies.
Or proboscideans.
Proboscideans. Proboscideans, of course. Yeah. Right. And so you would have had these proboscideans playing some role in shaping those environments.
So I have a question for you. Or go ahead.
No, it's just a fascinating question, because it's true. We don't really know. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on elephants in general. I did also look, and mastodons do fall on the size scale, are larger than forest elephants. They actually are closer to savanna elephants. So I suspect they might be a little more destructive. and might be a little closer to the savanna elephants on that spectrum of what their like damage control would be when you have those raging around in the forest.
But do you think though that we've been without elephants for so long in North America, like at least 10,000 years? Do you think that if we were to add them back in, that it would change the ecosystem too much? Like we've kind of reached a new equilibrium with large herbivores like bison and stuff, and now those have largely gone extinct for most areas. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, would rewilding be bringing us back to something that has already changed?
That's the ultimate question, really, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm not here suggesting we try to bring back dire wolves because there wouldn't be, I mean, there might be plenty of prey for them and all the white-tailed deer we have here, but there's not really the space for them. And humans, obviously play a huge role in where animals can and can't live, and thinking about the interactions and potential for conflict. And so, we could learn a lot from Africa and Asia, where people are constantly living at this interface of where, raccoons get in our garage or garbage or whatever, and it's like, oh, what a pain. But elephants raiding your crops, you can only imagine how much different that is, and
can destroy your livelihood,
right? And really be detrimental. And so I sympathize so much with these with these issues of human wildlife conflict, where it can be really difficult to figure out how to manage animals like that. And so it's true. I don't expect that we're going to be releasing elephants into the Smoky Mountains anytime soon. But it does make you think that that there was a role for them, and that ecosystem function that they fulfilled is largely absent, because white-tailed deer are not knocking trees over. They might be over browsing some areas, but they're probably having much different effects on the plant communities than something like a mega herbivore. And so I think that there are probably opportunities to study what those effects would be, looking, from paleontological records of what these animals would have been eating and where they would have been occurring. But maybe it's time to start doing these large scale manipulations, or at least do some experiments to test what those effects might have been, how they would have affected the habitat, and if it's worth doing to restore some of the early successional, the disturbed habitats that start to regrow thick thickets and early forests. And maybe all of a sudden we will see more golden mice in areas where they would have been common in these thick I don't know. I don't know a lot about plants. I'm not really a plant person. So probably there's a true definition for what a thicket is that I'm using it incorrectly.
That's okay. We're very, like I said, low key on this. Can you tell us what golden mice are and why you care about them so much?
Well, golden mice are this beautiful little rodent that are native throughout a lot of the southeastern U.S., but they're absent from. Well, it's unclear. A lot of these things are unclear because we don't survey small mammals as much as we could.
And so when you study their declines, like a lot of people don't know why. Is that what you would say is accurate? That like you can measure, you can estimate populations and look at trends, but for some of these bigger species like elephants, there's obviously poaching or habitat loss, but these smaller species, if the habitat's there, you're not finding them. Is that what you're trying to say? And they're still in decline?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say because um, it's not hard to get data on these species, but it is sometimes hard to get the support, the logistical support, or the buy-in to make strong, robust assessments of the populations and look at them long term. Especially rodents, right? You don't see very many rodent specific grants out there.
No, definitely not.
Right. But I think I was thinking about this. There's an elephant sanctuary over in Tennessee.
Oh, yeah. You should
And I was
totally
like,
study there.
yeah, there's this giant elephant sanctuary, and they have these free roaming elephants. And it's like, man, it would be interesting to go check that place out and see what those elephants on the landscape have done to those habitats, and see, what it might have looked like before and what it looks like now. But just making, I think with all research, we need to go beyond these just correlations of where species occur and get at some kind of, research experiments where we're manipulating the environment a little more and see if we can restore habitat. And so a lot of it falls within, monitoring long-term restoration projects. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's something cool that we could look into. Again, some of the rewilding research is interesting. I do agree that there are a lot of Pleistocene functions that were lost, but I also worry about accepting hippopotamuses in the Colombian river basins, just accepting them because they might play some role in replacing lost mega herbivore functions in Colombia. Those are Pablo Escobar's hippos, right? That escaped, and now there's hundreds of them.
For people who don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there definitely are some exclusion studies for elephants with savanna elephants. And I know John Polson at Duke is doing some with forest elephants, because actually it's really hard to exclude forest elephants just because it's hard to work in the forest. Like, it's hard. I can't imagine it would be hard to construct, but he was telling me about these bands that he wraps around trees that they don't destroy and knock down. But yeah, the Tennessee Elephant Sanctuary. So for those of you who don't know, it's so you have to be really careful with the word sanctuary. There's a lot of fake sanctuaries out there, but this one, they accept retired zoo elephants and circus elephants, and it is gigantic. And it's like this completely wild area, and elephants, like you said, are just roaming around. And it looks like they're in their natural habitat. Like if I were to show you a picture, you'd be like, oh, that's an elephant in Africa. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
except it's maples right, and oaks in the background.
If you didn't know the trees. But one thing I wanted to say is you talked about how we kind of overlook these successional habitats, these recovering habitats. And we shouldn't. And I think a lot of times as scientists and even just as people in general, we, like you said, we want to donate to the old growth forests, the ones that have never been disturbed. But these habitats can be really amazing for species. And when I went to Borneo, I went to a logged forest and it had all the same species there, and it was selectively logged. And then I have to plug my pepper pot study. I just did a study that came out with pepper pot. So this is a very small, only 8 square kilometers. And it's close to the capital of Suriname. So it's not 100% an urban park, but it's adjacent to a big city. And we compared it to a large preserve in central Suriname, which is more the old growth, or it is the old growth. And we definitely found differences, but we found way more species than we expected to find, including apex predators like puma and jaguars, and giant anteaters aren't apex predators, but sorry, I'm just thinking about the animals.
Well, they effectively are if you're an ant.
And they're that's true. And so large herbivores, or we didn't get many large herbivores. We just got tapir.
But you did get one of my
times.
other passions is our tapirs, right?
Yeah. So and we did get some deer, but not, I think only a couple of times. No peccary though, no pigs. But yeah, we were really surprised by that. And I really liked, like, I used to think about this undisturbed habitat and parks being separate than people, but I actually really like the kind of work that we do, because most animals don't live in parks. Most animals are in our habitats, are, right, where we, next to our workplaces and in our backyards, and these green patches in between homes and things.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think what it all comes down to is when you asked me about the baselines, we obviously have surpassed the baseline of the Pleistocene, and it's probably silly to set that as our target for a restoration goal, right?
Yeah.
But we are part of the system, and it should be our goal and priority to play some role in, undoing some of the historical damage that we've done, and think about how we could restore habitats, and reclaim habitats to become natural environments again. And all of a sudden, we can work towards reforestation and carbon sequestration for climate change, but remind ourselves that these other habitats do have value. And I think that, I work in the Keys, right? In the Florida Keys. And the Florida Keys, if you've never been there, they're a wacky place, but in North Key Largo, there's a sizable forest. It's about 1,200 hectares. And it's a sizable forest. And when you walk around in that forest, it looks like this post-apocalyptic world, because you'll be walking through, pretty thick vegetation and find a house, an old house or a foundation. Wow. Or telephone poles and things like that. And it just reminds you about, if, looking at the Mayan pyramids and how they've overgrown and reverted to these natural states. We're just one little component in the natural world. And I have to remind myself that sometimes, but nature finds a way. We could prod it in the right direction would be nice, and a good goal for us as conservation biologists to help move it all in the right direction.
To quote Jurassic Park.
What?
So one
nature
final
finds a way,
one final question. So ideally, if you could restore eastern forest by adding animals back, what would you do? And like, say there wasn't human conflicts, or people were willing to accept these animals, what types of animals would you want to see back here?
I think it would be nice to start small with animals that are still extant, right? That animals that are not extinct. So, seeing wolves and mountain lions that would have historically occurred throughout the eastern US, that would certainly help, in the long term. It would take time, but that would certainly help with managing things like overabundant white-tailed deer populations. I mean, we have hunting and things to manage deer populations, but it would be nice to restore some of those top-down processes. But the restoration of the reintroduction of elk to the Smokies has been largely successful, and I think a pretty cool step in the right direction. I think that there are probably other animals that historically occurred in the southeastern U.S. that could be, reintroduced. But so much of what we're learning now is that, a lot of carnivores are naturally recolonizing habitats because they're, making up for lost time where they were hunted into extirpation. And when you look at, it's cool. It's kind of exciting and encouraging. And I think we have a lot to learn about coexisting with large carnivores and mega herbivores and things like that. But I largely feel optimistic with a lot of the research coming out with, mitigating a human wildlife conflict and thinking about pepper pot, how restored habitats can be recolonized and host, these charismatic megafauna. And, I think we're moving in the right direction as a global community, and, realizing that some things that we've done have not been great, and let's try to fix them now.
Yeah. In Colorado, they recently voted to have wolves back, to reintroduce them by the slimmest of margins, but they did that.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Yeah.
And if you want to learn,
quite interesting.
If you want to learn more about mountain lions, I have a podcast episode about that. And people think they're in the eastern United States, and they are not. The camera trap evidence says otherwise. But I still get comments almost on a daily basis on my YouTube channel and sent to me. You can still send them to me, but but anyways, there's an episode where I explain that. Well, thank you so much. I'm definitely going to have you back on to talk about wood rats. We got to do wood rats and cats, 2 separate episodes, because cats actually, like you said, it's a very controversial topic, and I'm willing to take it on because I'm a cat lover and I'm a wildlife lover.
Right.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
No, I would be happy to. Yeah. Thank you. This was fun. It's nice to chat and get these science conversations going again. And I appreciate your insights on the elephant stuff. And I appreciate your rolling with my out there ideas.
Anytime.
Well, thanks again.
Mike is such a joy to talk to. I really do have to have him back on the podcast. He works on so many different cool species and projects. You can find him at covewildlife.com. You can see some of his cool camera trap photos, some of his photos from doing field work. You can also find him on Twitter at Mike_Cove. And he's on Instagram too, MikeCove1. And he also has a YouTube channel. And if you are an aspiring wildlife biologist, he has a great video series on occupancy modeling. So that's a really great resource for you. I think it's 4 videos and it teaches you the basics. So that's a really great resource. You can go to covewildlife.com and you can get all of these social links. I really look forward to having him back on to talk about wood rats and cats, using camera traps to count numbers, and just feral cats in general. We'll have to have a chat about that. Thanks, Mike, again.